Thank you, Shekhar, and it's wonderful to be here among friends. And you're not alone to have not attended the first economic summit. Even I didn't. So it's really a wonderful setting for discussion on, as Shekhar mentioned, an extremely important issue for all of us because he mentioned about a demographic disaster. If things are not taken care of regarding the young population and people who are just getting into the the working age group. But I would also say that it's just not the economic dimension of the problem that we should be aware of. Already in some of our countries, we are looking at the social problems that are arising because of the fact that we are not even able to take care of these young people. Now, in our presentation, and as Shekhar said, I'm going to quickly go over some of the concerns that I think we have been hearing since the morning. And, the distinguished ministers in the morning flagged this issue very prominently, the fact that we need to invest in human capital formation and the advantages that this region is going to reap as a result of this investment you're going to make. So I'm just going to reflect on some of the bigger issues that were pointed out, and take you through this presentation, which has following structure. We just talk about the demographic transition that has taken place in South Asia, which will emphasize the point that Shekhar was mentioning, looking at the change that has been taking place in the South Asian economies, because of which some of our economies have been, I would say, come under a lot of focus, and also expectations have risen sky high because for instance, the growth of the services sector has portrayed India in the forefront of the development, as it were. And one has to look at the service sector development and what is happening in terms of the skill that is there in this in these economies. We link it up to the human capital formation, and also look at the skill migration that is taking place, and finally we do ask this question whether there is going to be a demographic dividend after all. Now, the key characteristics, we all know that these are the key characteristics of the South Asian economies. It's overtly dependent on the services sector. There is a high rate of skill migration from the smaller economies and in particular. The economic growth experiences and reasonably high future development potential. These are all being talked about. The ongoing demographic change and challenges to further development potential, and the increase in the modern and traditional service exports, and the future supply of skilled labor. Now, over last few decades, the South Asian economies countries have seen a significant demographic transition, substantial decreases in infant mortality rate, and the fertility rate has actually also come down. The increasing life expectancy has taken place. Of course, there are certain countries which are at two ends of the two ends of the spectrum. Afghanistan continues to have high IMRs and TFRs, while Maldives and Sri Lanka are at the other end of the spectrum. Population in Sri Lanka is growing only at 1% per annum. And of course, there are endogenous factors like female health and education, which have fueled the pace of fertility decline. Now, this is something that we just tried to look at, looking at this table, the comparative picture as to how these figures have changed since the 60s, and very much the same pattern that I was talking about. Now here's the big story that we want to sort of convey, and which is that the working age population is expected to increase significantly in the most South Asian countries, resulting in steep declines in the dependency ratio, which is that, that this raises the specter of reaping the demographic dividend. So there will be a very large proportion of working population, and which is good news, because then, this is where the demographic dividend is going to come through. And what we see is that in the next few decades, in fact till the 2040, or around about 2045, there is going to be a convergence in the dependency ratio in all countries except Sri Lanka and Afghanistan. Sri Lanka has already passed that peak, and Afghanistan is still going to see decline in dependency ratio till all these countries actually converge. And in Sri Lanka, I said that the share of aging population is already in the increase. And if you look at this chart, it tells you all, because if you look at these countries, Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, Maldives, Nepal, Pakistan, and South Asia as a whole, you see this convergence, taking place around 2020, 40, 45. And this is the picture that you see in the case of the other countries. Sri Lanka has already, sort of passed the hump around 2010. And then Afghanistan is really going to go down to 2050 and beyond in terms of its dependency ratios. Now, the problem, one of the major problem areas is that the labor force participation rate has actually not shown much of a change in many countries. If at all, several countries show a bit of a decline in labor force participation. So here is the problem area that starts creeping up. Now, as mentioned earlier, that the South Asian economies have been service sector led, and services contribute to 55% of the region's output, but absorb only 27% of the workforce. And this is the problem, that the growing sector, the sector which has actually been fueling growth in many countries, has actually not been absorbing the workforce. For instance, we give the numbers for India. The services sector, the share in GDP increased by almost 10% in the last, since the 90s, but the share in workforce increased by only 3%. And of course, Sri Lanka is the only exception, where the share of employment services is 40%, and it exceeds the average for South Asia as a whole. So quite clearly, there is a need to ensure that skilled labor force is required to fuel the growth of modern and efficient service sectors. And the question really that arises here is that, is the education sector, or is the entire gamut of skilling that is taking place in this sector, is it adequate to take care of the needs of this sector? Now, this is by way of a graphical presentation of all that I said, that the share of services is increasing. Employment is pretty much stagnant, is not really showing any improvement. At the same time, we're also seeing, looking at the female workforce participation. Again, we see a great deal of variation amongst countries. There are Sri Lanka and Maldives are at one end of the spectrum, and then you have India somewhere in the middle, and Pakistan at the other end. And I think this is another issue that needs to be looked at. These are some of the trends that we found in the female workforce participation, and of course, we all know that South Asia is way below the global average of 40%. Only Sri Lanka and Nepal exceed the global average, and India and Pakistan remain the laggards. Now, the female employment in services, the data that what we looked at was really very limited, and so we could give only a few trends that I'm not going to repeat. You have all that on the slide here. Now, the problem that one would start looking at in the education sector, it really comes from this table, where we all know the kind of progress that most of our countries have made in the primary education. And this is an issue that has come up repeatedly in the context of the Millennium Development Goals and beyond. And we have been looking at some of the priorities for the post-2015 MDGs. Clearly, one of the things that comes up very prominently is that, as far as primary education is concerned, we have done quite a bit in terms of enrollment. But the moment we get into secondary sector, there's a steep fall in the enrollment rate. And of course, going on to the tertiary sector, the situation is pretty miserable. So there is a huge, I would say, policy problem when you're looking at how you're going to get this whole education sector, in proper shape, because it's not good enough to get just the primary education done, but when you talk about secondary and vocationalization of education, where you're going to make the young people employable, that is where we have a problem, and we don't seem to be addressing this issue. And I would like to hear more as to what your ideas are. Now, in terms of public spending on education, then this is an indicator that we all thought is very important to ensure that all these different market failures that we often talk about in the sector is set right. Doesn't make a pretty reading at all, and in many countries, including India. In fact, India has been quite a decline in public spending on education, despite the fact that there is so much of emphasis on social sector and on the part of the governments, and the need to refocus on social sector spending. In overall terms, we don't seem to be seeing much of an improvement in terms of public spending on education. Now, there are several challenges that we are seeing in the education sector, and again, some of these have been flagged here. Again, I don't want to read the whole the slide, but finally, as I mentioned here, that the problem of employment opportunities are compounded by the problems of employability of the population in the working age group. And what we find is that, and increasingly so, that even when these kids come out of higher education centers, we find that the industry has very little use for them. And one of our experiences in India has been that the information technology and the animal services sector, there has been shouting from the rooftop that these kids who are coming out of these technical institutions are no good for them as far as their job requirements are concerned. So again, there is a gap between what the pedagogy says and what the needs of the industry is in the marketplace. So quite apart from the fact that, and this is there even in the this is really about the quality of education. Something that we also have been talking about in the primary education, that you're only talking about enrollment in terms of numbers, but when you talk about the quality, it's really it's really very low, and a lot needs to be done in terms of improving the quality of education. We also looked at the patterns of migration. It's something which we were asked to reflect on, and this is a very active area in most of the South Asian countries. More than 26 million people born in South Asian countries are living outside the country of birth, and the rate of migration is substantially higher from the smaller countries. Again, the numbers are there for you to see. Now, the destinations, most of these, the migrants are moving into West Asia, and OECD follows quite closely. And as it is to be expected, the skilled migrants, head for the OECD countries, and the semi-skilled largely to West Asia. The implications, of course, remittances could be seen in terms of the brain gain and the kind of resources that they bring in. There's also the contribution that one can expect from the diaspora network, which has been sort of, active, and it has actually played some role in some countries. This is a table that we gave, and the benefits from migration in some, Nepal and Bangladesh is particularly significant in terms of the remittances, 22% of GDP and 11% respectively. And in case of India, the remittances have helped narrow current account deficit and has become quite important given the state of our current account now. Of course, remittances may also lead to poverty reduction, but may not ensure better access to public services. Now, the contribution of diaspora, very briefly, we have the experience in India of associations like the Indus Entrepreneurs and Silicon Valley Indian Professional Association, which assisted IT entrepreneurs with the business startups. And of course, diaspora can foster human capital accumulation in several ways. Remittances can augment incomes and ease the liquidity problems in these beneficiary households, and they can also contribute to increasing the average level of education in the home countries through knowledge spillovers. Now, the key messages that we have is quite obvious, that despite the falling dependency ratios, can we expect the demographic dividend to come through, and what is required to be done to respond to the changing composition of the GDP and the kind of skills that needs to be brought to bear so that the young population really can provide these countries with the benefits that we are all talking about from this young population. Now, education, human capital formation is clearly the area of a major deficit. Whichever way you look at it, I think there's a lot of work to be done, and the concern is that despite the pronouncements that are being made in different countries by the policymakers, the actual work on the ground has not really responded to the gaps that we have in the education sector. So one also needs to ask this question whether an overemphasis on primary education actually led to sort of a mismatch that we see in terms of the enrollment that I was talking about. And I think the countries, the policymakers need to think very seriously as to how they are going to bridge the huge gaps that we find today in terms of enrollment across the three levels that I talked about. And of course, migration could help, but I think again the benefits are really coming from the skilled migrants to some of these countries, and that too is dependent on whether or not this sector, these countries are able to generate enough skills so that these skilled people who go out and get further training can come back and benefit the countries of their birth through these knowledge spillovers. So these are the few points that I wanted to make. I think I am on time, and thank you for your attention.